All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty big.
Yeah. Which
Capitalism, socialism, and communism.
three big ones.
And to guide us, we've got this college level presentation all about the history and the what makes them different, like these big ideologies.
It's kind of like we're back in school, right?
Yeah,
But without the exams this time.
exactly. Just pure learning.
Just the good stuff.
Exactly. So imagine this. It's the 1800s.
Okay.
Factories are popping up left and right.
Oh, yeah.
Cities are getting taxed.
Mm.
And basically everyone's arguing about like the best way to organize society and like, who gets what.
Yeah, you can say this is where ideology really takes center stage.
Ideology.
Like it becomes super crucial. Like it's the lens people use to make sense of the world.
Oh, I
And
said
how
it.
things should work.
Like a framework.
Yeah. And during the Industrial Revolution, these debates, they were intense.
So where do we even begin? Let's talk capitalism. Didn't that kind of like win out during this time?
Well, yeah, it rose to prominence, that's for sure.
Like it was the dominant system.
And its champion was Adam Smith.
Oh yeah, Adam Smith, the big name in economics.
Free markets, limited government, laissez-faire.
Laissez-faire, hands-off approach.
Exactly. Individual ownership, competition, those were his big things.
And he believes that everyone acting selfishly would actually benefit society. That's always kind of tripped me up.
Yeah, that's the thing about Smith, right? He argued that competition would create this invisible hand,
Oh, right, the invisible hand.
guiding the market towards progress,
Mm.
innovation, all that good stuff.
And I mean, it did lead to like huge advances, right? Like the Industrial Revolution, you can't deny the progress.
Oh, absolutely. Incredible wealth,
Mm.
new technologies, the world changed rapidly.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it? I mean,
Yeah.
there were downsides, right?
Of course, not everyone benefited equally. And there was definitely a lack of like a safety net for those who struggled.
Right, like those who were left behind.
So yeah, vast inequality was a big issue.
And that's where people like John Stuart Mill come in, right? Didn't he try to balance things out a bit?
Yeah, Mill was all about utilitarianism. It's
Utilitarianism.
the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
So not just letting the market run wild.
Exactly. He thought government intervention was sometimes necessary
To step in.
to address things like poverty, even within a capitalist system.
Interesting. I remember reading somewhere that John Stuart Mill was like a child prodigy,
Oh, yeah.
like fluent in Greek at age 3 or something crazy like that.
Wow. Not your average advocate for the working class, huh?
That's for sure. But his ideas about social responsibility within capitalism were like actually really influential, right?
Oh, totally. He really challenged that pure laissez-faire approach.
So we see this tension building within capitalism itself, the individual versus the collective good.
Mhm.
Was this what gave rise to socialism?
Well, socialism grew out of a deep concern for the inequalities and the injustices, that people saw as like baked into capitalism.
Inherent to the system,
Yeah, socialists wanted the government to take a more active role
more involved.
in regulating business, providing social welfare, making sure wealth was distributed more fairly.
But still protecting individual liberty.
Yeah, it was more about balance.
So a balancing act between individual freedom and the needs of society.
Right. And to really understand how this evolved, we need to consider the historical context of Marxism.
Karl Marx. Now we're getting into some heavy stuff.
Marx and his buddy Friedrich Engels,
The dynamic duo.
they were writing at the peak of the Industrial Revolution.
And they were not fans of what they were seeing. Right?
No, they were horrified by the conditions in factories, the poverty.
Like real world consequences of capitalism run amok.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the immense wealth of just a handful of industrialists.
So they witnessed the dark underbelly of capitalism firsthand.
Oh, especially in London, they saw it all.
They saw how the system could create winners and losers on a massive scale.
And they believed capitalism inherently exploited workers for the benefit of the wealthy.
The bourgeoisie.
That's the term they used, yeah. And they pitted them against the proletariat, or the working class.
So their critique of capitalism was sharp and fierce.
Oh, absolutely. They saw history as this constant struggle between these two classes.
So what was their solution? Like, how did they propose to fix all this?
Well, their answer was communism.
Communism, a radical idea.
They argued that to achieve true equality, you had to abolish private property altogether.
Whoa, no private property at all.
Nope, everything owned collectively.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah. The means of production, everything. shared by everyone.
Their goal was a classless society, right?
A utopia where wealth and resources were distributed equally.
That's a pretty revolutionary concept even today.
It turns everything on its head, right?
Absolutely. And it's important to differentiate between communism as this like theoretical ideal, this perfect society,
Yeah,
and how it actually played out in the real world.
that's a whole other story for sure.
And that's what we'll explore next time.
We'll dive into the real-world attempts to put these communist ideals into practice.
Buckle up.
Yeah, because things get complicated.
It's going to be a wild ride.
And we'll see how those grand ideas actually played out.
Stay tuned.
Can't wait.
It's crazy how these ideas like went from the minds of these thinkers
Yeah.
to like actually shaping entire nations.
Yeah, it's wild to see how communism went from theory
Like an
to
idea.
all these different forms of government.
Like in the real world.
In the 20th century, yeah.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit.
Sure.
I mean, I think most folks, when they hear communism, they probably picture like the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the USSR, for sure.
Like the classic example, right?
Totally. After that 1917 revolution, they really went all in on a centralized, state-controlled model.
Like the government was in charge of everything.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
They industrialized super fast, but their system, it was kind of rigid. you
Like a
know?
giant machine.
Yeah, not a lot of room for change.
So what happened?
Well, innovation lagged behind because there wasn't much incentive for individuals to be creative.
Right, if you're not rewarded for taking risks, why bother?
Exactly. And then there's the human cost, too.
Oh, right, we can't forget that part.
Authoritarian rule, political repression, individual rights
Mm-hmm.
often took a back seat.
All for the sake of the collective.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson, right?
Like good intentions don't automatically equal good outcomes.
Especially when you start suppressing individual
It's
freedoms.
a slippery slope.
Totally. And this brings us to another really interesting case, China.
Oh, yeah, China.
They've taken a very different approach, haven't they?
It's almost like they've blended communism and capitalism,
Yeah.
which sounds a little contradictory, right?
It's a bit of a paradox, for sure. After Mao Zedong died, they started incorporating these market mechanisms.
So they kept the communist state,
One-party rule, yeah.
but opened up to trade and investment
They embraced the global market.
and their economy. I mean, it's exploded.
Incredible growth, lifted millions out of poverty.
So they've achieved a level of economic success that, honestly, a lot of capitalist countries haven't matched.
It's pretty remarkable, yeah.
But has this also led to some of those same issues we see in capitalism?
You mean like growing inequality?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
All right.
China shows that economic pragmatism
Like being practical.
can coexist with political control, at least for a while.
But for how long, right? And at what cost?
That's the question. Can this system address things like social justice?
And the environment.
Yeah, in the long run.
Yeah.
That remains to be seen.
Okay, so we've got these two big players, but what about other examples of communism in action?
Yeah, the presentation highlights how different those experiences have been.
Okay, like what?
Well, Cuba, for instance,
Cuba.
they've had economic struggles and limits on political freedom,
Right, that's no secret.
but they've also prioritized social welfare.
Okay.
Things like high literacy rates and healthcare access.
So even within communism, there are different priorities, different outcomes.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
And then there's North Korea,
North Korea, yeah.
which is like a whole other story, right?
Yeah, a tragic one, really.
Very isolated, authoritarian regime.
With a really terrible record on human rights.
Like, it's a stark reminder of how an ideology, even one that starts with good intentions,
Mhm.
can be twisted, you know?
Absolutely. Used to justify oppression and control.
It's chilling to see how the goal of a classless society can be so distorted.
It underscores the need for critical thinking.
Oh, for sure.
We can't just blindly accept any ideology.
We have to look at the impact it has.
On people's lives, hold leaders accountable.
Okay, so we've explored capitalism, socialism, and communism, but I gotta ask,
Yeah,
what does all this mean for, like, the average person?
that's a great question. Understanding these ideologies helps us become more informed citizens,
More engaged.
able to participate in these important debates.
So it's not about picking sides.
No, it's about understanding the
Have
complexity,
nuance.
the trade-offs. Yeah. Every system has its strengths and weaknesses.
So there's no one right answer. No magic bullet.
That's the big takeaway, I think. No system is perfect.
We're all just trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and maybe that's the most important lesson here.
What's that?
We need to be open to different ideas, learn from history,
Be willing to change.
keep searching for solutions that balance individual freedom with the well-being of society as a whole.
Wow, this deep dive has really given me a lot to think about,
That's what it's all about. Remember, knowledge is power.
especially when we use it to make the world a better place.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
We've been talking about the ideas behind capitalism, socialism, and communism, but I'm really curious to see how those theories actually worked out,
Like when they were put into practice.
in the real world.
It's one thing to study the theories,
Right.
but seeing how they shaped actual societies, how people actually lived.
That's the real test.
Totally.
So let's start with a big one, the Soviet Union.
Okay, the USSR.
What can we learn from their attempt to, build a communist society?
Well, they really went for that centralized model.
Centralized.
Yeah, like state-controlled everything.
Like everything.
Pretty much. The government owned and managed almost everything.
So no room for, individual initiative or private business?
Not much, no. At first, it did lead to some rapid industrialization.
Okay.
They expanded social welfare programs, too.
Like healthcare and education?
Yeah, they made big progress in those areas. But over time, the system, it became too rigid.
Like it couldn't adapt.
Exactly. Couldn't keep up with the changing times.
I can imagine, trying to plan and control every single detail of the economy.
Yeah.
It's got to be impossible.
It stifled innovation.
Because there was no incentive to be creative.
Right. Why take risks if you don't get rewarded?
And of course, we have to talk about the human cost.
Oh, absolutely.
The Soviet regime became very authoritarian, repressive,
Individual freedoms were often sacrificed,
for the so-called good of the collective.
It's a tough lesson.
It shows that even when your goals are good, like equality and social welfare, the methods you use,
They matter.
they have to be considered.
If you suppress individual rights in dissent, things can go very wrong.
Yeah, power corrupts.
It's a classic story.
And that brings us to another really interesting case. China.
Okay, China.
They've done things very differently, haven't they?
They have. They kind of combined communism with capitalism in this unique way.
It's like a hybrid system.
Yeah, some call it market socialism.
Or even communist capitalism.
Bit of a paradox, that's for sure.
So how's it worked out for them?
Well, after Mao Zedong died, they started opening up their economy,
Okay.
allowed for more private businesses and foreign investment.
So they kept the communist state, the one-party rule.
Yeah, but they embraced those market forces.
And their economy has boomed.
Incredible growth, yeah. They've lifted millions out of poverty.
They've achieved a level of economic success that many capitalist countries haven't been able to match.
It's really remarkable.
But has this also led to some of those negative consequences we often see in capitalism?
You're talking about income inequality, exploitation.
Yeah, those sorts of things.
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
China shows that you can have economic growth
Hmm.
even within a system that still have a lot of political control.
But is it sustainable?
That's the question. Can they address those social and environmental issues in the long term?
Only time will tell, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it all plays out.
Okay, so we've talked about the Soviet Union and China, but what about other examples?
Sure.
Are there any other insights from the presentation about how communism's been implemented?
Yeah, it emphasizes how diverse those experiences have been.
Diverse.
Like take Cuba, for instance.
Oh, Cuba, yeah.
Despite their economic struggles,
Okay.
and, they've faced a lot of limits on political freedoms.
Right.
They've really prioritized social welfare.
Okay.
They've got impressive literacy rates.
Right.
And healthcare is very accessible.
So different priorities, different outcomes, even within communism.
Exactly. Each country has its own unique context, its own history.
And then there's North Korea.
North Korea, yeah,
Right,
that's a much
right.
darker story,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
It's a very isolated, authoritarian regime.
It was a terrible record on human rights, yeah.
It's a sad example of how an ideology, even one that starts with good intentions,
To be twisted.
and used to justify oppression and cruelty.
It reminds us that we can't be naive.
Right.
We have to be critical thinkers, constantly evaluating these ideologies.
And holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly.
So after this deep dive into capitalism, socialism, and communism, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they, go out into the world?
Well, I think the most important lesson is that no system is perfect.
There's no magic bullet.
Every system has its pros and cons, its successes and failures,
It's about understanding those nuances.
and being open to learning from both history and what's happening in the world right now.
So it's not about picking a winner.
No, it's about being informed, engaged citizens
Thinking critically.
and working together to create societies that are just prosperous and sustainable.
Wow, that's a great way to put it.
And hopefully this deep dive has given everyone some food for thought.
Yeah, definitely lots to ponder.
Remember, the learning never stops.
And that wraps up our deep dive into capitalism, socialism, and communism. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep those minds curious and engaged, and we'll see you next time.